let's dive into an idea hidden in biblical language that is frankly mind-blowing. It's something that could totally change how you read some of the Bible's most famous and most confusing passages. So here's the big question we're tackling. When the biblical writers talked about heaven and earth, were they secretly talking about something else? Was it some kind of code for the Jewish temple in Jerusalem? Now, the simple answer here is kind of weird. It's both no and yes, absolutely. And that contradiction is exactly what makes this so fascinating. See, it's not a simple one-to-one code, but a deep, symbolic connection that unlocks a whole new layer of meaning. So let's unpack that, right? We've got to separate the literal, everyday meaning of heaven and earth from a really powerful symbolic meaning that was just as real to the people back then. Okay, first, the literal meaning. For most ancient Jews, 99% of the time, heaven and earth meant exactly what you'd think: the entire cosmos, all of creation, the whole shebang. We see this default meaning everywhere. Genesis, the Psalms, you name it. But here is the twist, and it is a game changer. The Jerusalem temple wasn't just some building. It was intentionally designed and understood to be a symbolic model of the entire universe, a microcosm of heaven and earth, all packed into one sacred space. And look, this isn't just some modern theory we cooked up. We have compelling evidence from the ancient world itself that shows this is exactly how they thought about the temple. They saw it as a model of the universe. I mean, we even have direct quotes from the time. The first-century Jewish historian Josephus, he flat out says that the temple's architecture was designed to represent the entire cosmos. That's about as clear a historical link as you can get. And this symbolism was incredibly specific. Think of it like a sacred map. The innermost sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, that was heaven, God's personal throne room. The inner court was like the sky, the firmament, and the outer court, that represented the land and the sea, the world of humanity. And this wasn't some fringe idea either. Another major thinker of that era, Philo of Alexandria, said the exact same thing. He wrote that the temple symbolized both the heavenly and earthly realms. So this was a well-known, established concept. Okay, so the temple is a mini-universe. Why does that matter? Well, because it becomes the key, the decoder ring, really, for unlocking some of the most dramatic and confusing language in the whole Bible, the apocalyptic language of the prophets. You see, the prophets used what scholars call apocalyptic rhetoric. They'd paint these huge, cosmic pictures, the sun going dark, stars falling from the sky, but they weren't trying to describe the end of the physical universe. They were using that epic language to talk about massive upheavals here on Earth, like the fall of a kingdom or a major shift in God's covenant with his people. And we see this pattern over and over. When Isaiah describes the fall of Babylon, he talks about the stars losing their light. When Ezekiel describes the fall of Egypt, he talks about covering the heavens. It was a standard tool in their literary toolbox for describing world-shaking events. Now, let's see how all of this builds toward one of the most pivotal events in history, an event that brought all this symbolic language into razor-sharp focus. So here's the quick timeline. Around 30 CE, you have Jesus' ministry, and he's making some pretty intense prophecies about the temple. Fast forward a generation to 66 CE, and a massive bloody war breaks out between the Jews and the Roman Empire. And then in 70 CE, the unthinkable happens. The Romans conquer Jerusalem and burn the temple to the ground. And you have to get this. For the people living then, this wasn't just about losing a beautiful building. The temple was the center of their covenantal world. Its destruction was the collapse of their entire spiritual and political order. In their symbolic language, it really was the end of a world. Now, with all that context, the historical trauma and the symbolic worldview, let's go back and reread some key passages in the New Testament. This is where it all clicks into place. So think about it. When Jesus talks about the temple's destruction and then immediately says heaven and earth will pass away, what would his audience have heard? They're the ones who already understood the temple as a symbolic heaven and earth. They would have heard something very different than what we hear today. This gives us two ways to read Jesus' words. The literal reading assumes he's talking about the end of the actual planet, but the symbolic reading, the one that's grounded in their ancient worldview, suggests he's prophesying the end of the temple-centered covenant order, an event his listeners would actually live to see. And this right here is the verse that gives that symbolic reading so much power. Jesus says this generation will see it all happen. If he meant the literal end of the universe, well, that's a failed prophecy. But if he was using that classic prophetic language to describe the temple's destruction, that happened in 70 CE, well within the lifetime of this generation. So what's the big takeaway from all this? Why does it matter? Well, understanding this ancient symbolism doesn't just clear up a few confusing verses, it reframes how we can read entire sections of the Bible. This perspective means that heaven and earth passing away could refer to the end of that temple system. The end of the age becomes the end of a covenantal era, not the end of the planet. Those dramatic images of falling stars, powerful metaphors for political and religious collapse. It also means that Jesus' followers saw his prophecies as dramatically and accurately fulfilled in the year 70. And even the book of Revelation, with its vision of a new heaven and a new earth, is drawing directly from this deep well of cosmic temple imagery. And that leaves us with a final, provocative thought. If a phrase as fundamental as heaven and earth carried this rich, symbolic weight for its original audience, what other parts of these ancient texts might we be reading with our modern, literal eyes, completely missing the world of meaning hidden just beneath the surface?